nationwide. Find out more at cspanradio.org.
The Islamic Society of North America held their annual convention last weekend here in Washington, D.C. On Saturday, a panel took a look at the state of civil liberties in America following September 11th. You'll hear from leaders of groups including the Arab American Institute and the NAACP. The discussion runs almost 2 hours.
Well, inshallah, we'll begin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in birahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. My dear Muslims, we gather here tonight at a very critical time in the history of American society, if I may dare use a little bit of hyperbole there. While being the bastion of individual liberties and personal freedoms, this country is now at a threshold where action that we individually and collectively take can have a tremendous impact on how civil liberties and personal freedoms get to be viewed and respected by institutions of authority in this part of the world. September 11th has given us a stark reminder about how true it is that we need to be eternally vigilant in order to retain the freedom that is hard fought and won over years. As governmental action in the so-called war against terrorism is stretching and ever increasingly breaking long accepted bounds of constitutionally mandated protections and law enforcement guidelines. As we see our government agencies increasingly being grossly indifferent, and as we see violations of individual civil rights and personal liberties increase, it is time for us to take note. It is time for us to take note that the targeting of minority groups, in this particular case Muslims and Arab Americans, cannot continue the way it has been doing. Blatant racial profiling, detentions without due process, use of not only secret evidence, but secret courts and military tribunals. We must speak out against this and understand what is at stake. And of course, we are facing now the stretching to the limit, the scope of even the phrase enemy combatant, as we speak about keeping Americans from complete access, or even a little bit of access to the legal system in perpetuity. So, my dear friends, it is time for us to understand what is happening. That is an obligation each one of us has to take. And then it is a time for us to understand what can and cannot be done within the framework of permissible activity within this country. Tonight, we are privileged to have a distinguished set of panelists amongst us who will bring a focus that will be somewhat different from what you may have heard or will hear at the other 9/11 sessions in this conference. We are talking about a focus coming in from the vantage point outside the traditional Muslim community. So let us keep that in mind, because we've got 3 speakers here, and inshallah maybe a 4th joining us, who will bring to us an interfaith community perspective, a speaker who will focus on the Arab American side of the equation, and then finally a gentleman who will talk about the legal side of it, in the trenches legal, practical perspectives, given the current context of the situation and civil rights litigation that is going on. My name is Kareem Irfan, and I represent the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, and I'll be privileged to be moderating the session. The speakers will be speaking for approximately 12 to 15 minutes, and that'll give us about 20 minutes of questions and answers. And inshallah, we'll conduct all of that on time in a very orderly fashion. For my first speaker here, the gentleman I'll be inviting, I know him personally, and it'll be difficult for me not to talk too much about him. So I'll make a very pointed effort, Mr. Alexander, to not do that. He comes from a perspective of a truly informed understanding about the history of religions. He's uniquely qualified to speak from the interfaith perspective, carrying a bachelor's, a master's in philosophy, and a doctorate degree from Columbia University in the history of religions. Scott has taught courses on Islam and the history of religions at Columbia University, Fordham University, and Princeton University. He's currently the Associate Professor of Islam at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and Director of the Program in Catholic Muslim Studies at the school's Bernardine Center for Theology and Ministry. Scott is the author of a number of articles on Islamic history and religion, and he's been published in scholarly journals and encyclopedias all over. He's a personal friend and a delight to associate with, and in the Chicago area, he's extremely recognized for any time that he speaks up from the perspective of the Abrahamic faiths. He is very, very respected and well listened to. And he's been a strong supporter of the cause for Muslim rights. I invite Scott Alexander, but let me warn you that I hope he will pick the right language to talk to you in, because he can speak classical Arabic, Persian, French, German, and Greek too. So I hope that for your benefit, he'll pick the least complex of these languages, and that is English. So I present to you Scott Alexander.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Kareem exaggerates. Those are some languages in which I have a moderate research competency, but I'm very flattered, and I thank him for his kind words. It's an honor to be here with you this evening, and I bring you greetings from Catholic Theological Union and all your friends at that institution, and all your friends in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and your friends in the Catholic Church around the country, and indeed around the world. What I thought, thank you. I have some things to say, some very brief things to say about that friendship, but I want to save the best for last. What I want to do is talk about three things. Yes? I'm on the wrong microphone. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
I guess for the taping we need to have both.
Both. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I'm not used to double microphones. Boy, I'm getting up in the world, I think, huh? Three things I'd like to do, spending a few minutes on each. One is to give a spiritual reflection on the virtue of self-criticism. The second is to make a political suggestion that I hope sort of opens up a conversation for more suggestions like it. It might not be a good suggestion in and of itself, but at least it's a start. And then the third will be to ask, or at least raise the question, what is significant about the impact of interreligious relationships, particularly in the U.S., on the dynamic that is currently affecting Muslims and Muslim civil liberties in the aftermath of September 11th. And it's in that context at the end that I'll talk about what I hope is our, inshallah, long-lasting friendship. First, the spiritual reflection on self-criticism. We hear a lot of language in the media. It comes through time and time again in editorials in the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times and the Washington Post and other esteemed and widely read newspapers and the television media, that there is a lack of self-criticism in the Muslim world. There's a lack of self-criticism in each and every human heart. So I would expect that there's a lack of self-criticism in the Muslim world, and increasing self-criticism, if it's kept within certain parameters and done reasonably, is usually a good thing to do. No one would debate that. But the comments and the call for self-criticism seem to me to be lopsided. Because I haven't heard any sustained discourse since the great tragedies of last year in which America, as a populace, looking at its foreign policy, looking at its internal social life and the many injustices and challenges in that respect that we still very much face as a society, there hasn't been much self-criticism of that. It seems that September 11th, or any occasion that's as tragic as that, is an opportunity for what the Quran refers to as tawbah, or what the Gospels talk about in the Greek as metanoia, or repentance, changing, turning back to God, because obviously when something like that happens, something's wrong. We're going in a direction we oughtn't be going in, and we need to turn in another direction. as individuals, as nation states, as civilizations. So there needs to be more self-criticism, I think, on the part of Americans looking deeply into U.S. foreign policy, into other aspects of American society. And I think in some ways that self-criticism needs to be led by the amicable but firm help of our Muslim brothers and sisters as an integral part of the fabric of American society, to help us do that introspection that's necessary, to help us locate the arrogance where there's arrogance, the arrogance that leads to the spread of hatred, the arrogance that can lead to more violence in the world. And I think we're in a very precarious time as we hear the rhetoric coming from the current administration and other quarters of our society attempting to gear us up for what I can only see will be a debacle if it ever happens in Iraq. God forbid it happens. The Catholic Church in particular has been very much interested in Western self-criticism. In fact, in the early 80s, John Paul II published an encyclical letter on social concerns in which he excoriated the vices of both Eastern socialism, which he knew very well as a Pole, as well as Western capitalism. And I think this is a time when we're experiencing the Enron scandal, the WorldCom, and this trouble in the American economy, and we're faced with the real problem of greed that we have in this country. We have to ask ourselves, how is this greed affecting our relationships with other people around the world? So there's much to be done in terms of multilateral self-criticism. The second, the political suggestion, as we live in a time where, not to be too gloomy about it, it seems that the darkness, the foreboding darkness may be enclosing upon us, the darkness that Surah Al-Falaq refers to in the plea, وَمِن شَرِّ غَاسِقٍ إِذَا وَقَبْ. In this darkness, recently I read something by Christopher Edley at Harvard University, who is on the Civil Liberties Commission, the U.S. Commission on Civil Liberties, who suggested that we pay very careful attention to the fact that in times of national emergency, quote unquote, such as we have now, liberty's familiar safeguards can't be relied upon. The courts, congressional watchdogs, political pressure, a lot of that falls away. Some of it stays in place, but a lot of it falls away. And he warns that we need to look to certain alternatives and take concrete steps to ensure that Muslims and other American civil rights be respected in the current context. And among these, one of the things he suggests, and I'm a little out of my depth here, and my colleagues who have made their careers in the protecting of civil rights and all can probably analyze this suggestion more critically and more effectively than I can. But he suggests that in the new Office of Homeland Security, there be an Office of Rights and Liberties that must be created, because part of protecting the security of the homeland is protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of the homeland. And that And it would be the duty of this office to make sure that the guidelines, even of very troublesome legislation like USA Patriot Act, are followed to the letter, and that no secret policies sort of become part and parcel about how the government operates. I mean, it's not a corrective, I don't think, for what's going on right now, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And I think those of us who support this kind of idea need to be vocal about it and need to sort of spread the word and open up more conversation about such things. As I say, I hope that kind of suggestion, in the critique of that suggestion and discussion of that suggestion, leads to other concrete suggestions. What can we do to insulate particularly the Muslim community from continued erosion of its civil liberties? This is particularly important if another tragic event should happen. If another tragic event should happen in this country, I think we have to be prepared for that. And we have to be prepared. We have to prepare the American public to respond appropriately and to respond with justice and compassion. The last point, what is significant about the impact of the interreligious dynamic on the protection or erosion of Muslim civil liberties in the U.S. in the aftermath of 9/11? Well, I think there's bad news and there's good news. And again, I said I'd save the good news for the last. The bad news is, as many of you know, there have been some very disturbing comments that have emerged from the Christian right about Islam. Franklin Graham, back in November of 2001, referred to Islam, astaghfirullah, as an evil religion. Reverend Maury Davis in Madison, Tennessee, made a similar reference. Jerry Vines, in June of this year, right before the start of the Southern Baptist Convention, made some comments about the Prophet Muhammad, which I do not want to repeat, but if you want to learn about that, you can come up to me later and I'll give you some details about those things. Benny Hinn and others. Now, some might say, and really I need to pay close attention to this because these are my fellow Christians. They don't come from my tradition. They're not Catholics. They're evangelicals, and we have many differences. But I need to be very careful about approaching them with the dignity that they deserve as creatures of God. At the same time, I think we need to be aware of the fact that these aren't just people who are speaking as individuals on a political or religious fringe. These are actually folks whose religious outlook, and it's unfortunate that it's part of their religious outlook, I think, has very strong ties with political power in this country. And so our Attorney General and our President have very strong and close ties with the Christian right. And I think we need to open up a dialogue with some of these folks and ask them to answer some fair but pointed questions so that we can get an idea of where they stand on this kind of assault, really, on Islam. So there's a little bit of bad news, but the good news is it's been my experience, mashallah, since September 11th, that you have many friends in the interfaith community, many friends in the Jewish community, many friends certainly in the Catholic community. Just recently, on August 20th, a delegation from Al-Azhar and the Vatican convened to issue a statement on racism, a joint statement on racism. And we finished an institute back in mid-July, an institute on Islam, where the officers, the people who direct interreligious and ecumenical affairs offices in the various Catholic archdioceses throughout the country came to Chicago to learn more about Islam. These are people who had already done some basic study, and it was an advanced institute where they got to meet Muslims and talk with other scholars and ask questions that they had about how to strengthen relationships with the Muslim community. So that even though there is that darkness that's enveloping, we need to remember that that darkness is spoken of in Surah Al-Falaq, and that we can take refuge in the Lord of the Dawn, who holds out light for us if we only strive for that light. Thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum.
Ladies and gentlemen, that Scott Alexander has raised a very important point. And lest we all get caught up in depression based on what we hear outside about the attack on our rights, it's important for us to note that we are not in this alone. This is our country, and there are groups who feel strongly for justice. And of course, as Scott made the important point, as we move forward with this concept of homeland security, it indeed behooves us and our leaders to concentrate on the civil rights, because the rights and liberties that we maintain will be an essential aspect of guaranteeing that we move forward with security. And in that regard, I cannot help but note that the Muslim Americans of today will be a very integral role, will be playing an integral role, Scott, because this concept of security, the concept of justice and peace, is so inherent to Islam that just the inclusion of Muslims who come from an informed viewpoint and bring to bear what Islam demands in these circumstances is going to be of tremendous importance. And I hope that by our active participation, by building coalitions with friends and other groups who feel like us, who think like us, who act like us, that we will be able to come up with a common voice that guarantees the focus on these liberties. And with that, it transitions me into our next speaker, Mr. Jean AbiNader. He is the managing director of the Arab American Institute, and he brings to us a unique perspective based on coalition building, and he's indicated that that is one of the aspects that he will talk about. He is, as I indicated, the managing director, and he's responsible for the overall operations and program management for the Institute. He has about 30 years of experience in international business and public affairs. and he's acted in a number of leadership roles as a consultant, a corporate executive, and as a CEO of many international trade and public affairs associations. More importantly, he has extensive experience in the Middle East as a consultant on policy and trade, focusing on enhancing U.S.-Arab commercial relations. So with that background, I think it'll be very interesting to hear what Mr. AbiNader proposes that we do to respond in these critical situations. Mr. AbiNader.
And if I don't have the answers, don't feed me tonight. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor for me to be here representing our institute and Jim Zogby, our president, who was actually coming, but alhamdulillah, he became a grandfather for the first time last week, and so he's with his granddaughter in Philadelphia, and he sends his regards. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the Arab American Institute and Arab Americans because I think that sometimes in periods of stress and in periods of discrimination and in periods where we feel lost and where we feel isolated, we sometimes need to understand that what is going on is not going on only to us, but to hundreds and thousands of people across this country. And in particular, we have to recognize that immigrants and Muslims in particular are those who are being targeted by this so-called selective enforcement of legislation that is being not only proposed but enacted by both local and federal governments. I think, though, that we have to be realistic and understand that these laws are not new in our history, that the United States has gone through cycles of periods of discrimination, particularly against people from immigrant backgrounds. And of course, it's ironic to all of us that a country that is formed from immigrants has such bigotry and such discrimination at its core. But essentially, we have to deal with the fact that there are at least 30%, 35% of this country who have in their own minds a hate, who in their own minds have the inability to comprehend and tolerate difference, who have in their own hearts not love but hate. People who ascribe to Christianity, people who ascribe to Judaism, people who even ascribe to Islam, but externally they are people who are not consistent with their faith. And so we have to look at these people and understand that what is going on is a reflection of their own inner weakness and their own inner disgust with their inability to see their lives and live them fully. And it is from that ignorance and that inability to comprehend and tolerate difference that we have the stereotypes that have become so prevalent in the media today with regard to Arabs and Muslims. And I say to you that I think the federal government bears direct responsibility, along with our friends at Fox TV and other places, for the images and stereotypes that are underwriting the discrimination and bigotry in this country. And I think that we have to say to our government that you can't, on the one hand, say do not discriminate against Arabs and South Asians and Muslims, and on the other hand, make sure that every new law and procedure is targeted at Muslims and Arab Americans. But as I said, we are not alone in this struggle. All immigrants, all minorities, all ethnic groups face these civil liberties challenges. Let me give you some examples. If you look at the recent press accounts of the campaign by the Social Security Administration, where they're sending out to employers and saying, your numbers, Social Security numbers, are not matching up with the employees on our records. And so obviously these people are turning around and they're firing people who are working for them with illegal Social Security numbers. Well, what communities are being hit hardest by that? So far, about 300,000 Hispanics and 100,000 Koreans, not Muslims, not Arabs. So the ethnic communities and immigrant communities are recognizing that what Mr. Ashcroft is doing is not only contrary to American policy, but strikes hardest at those people least able to defend ourselves. And that's why it's our responsibility as people who are in this country, as citizens, as people who are born in this country and who have lived here, to make a stand for the immigrants in this country and defend them against what's going on from the federal government. We need to look very hard at how we end our isolation by reaching out, as Scott said, to others across things that don't divide us, but things that make us different. I think the great blessing of the Ummah is that we are all different and that we are all the same. We're all different in the fact that we come from different cultures and backgrounds. But you know, in my home, I was raised in a Christian home from Lebanon, and there's no country that knows more about the divisions of Christianity and Islam and Judaism than Lebanon historically. And yet in our house we have the Quran read to us every week by my father. And why was that? It was because it's part of our culture and part of our heritage, and to deny that is to deny part of our heart and to deny part of our soul. And that's not who we are. So we reject that. Just as you must reject those people in your community who say we cannot work with other people, who say that Muslims can't reach out to Christians and can't reach out to Jews. We have to. This is how America works. America works because coalitions work and because people share dreams. They don't try to take dreams, they share dreams. We have a right to our opportunities just like every generation before us. The bigots that opposed the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Cubans before us are now opposed to us. And they will fall by the wayside, but we have to show people that we are committed to this country and that this country owes us a commitment as well, because we are here to strengthen and bless this country with the heritage that we bring to it, the heritage of our religions and the heritage of our cultures. So if you ask me about building coalitions, I say yes, as broad as possible. Interfaith coalitions, interethnic coalitions, coalitions with peace and justice groups. In our offices just 2 weeks ago, the major Muslim groups met with us and with 28 different coalition groups: Koreans, Chinese, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Hispanics, African Americans. We're putting together a major demonstration headed by Jesse Jackson, the National Organization of Women, the AFL-CIO, on April 13th, where we're going to march on the Justice Department, hold a prayer vigil, and say to them, where are the freedoms that this country was founded on? Why are they being denied to immigrants? Why are they being denied to Muslims? Why are they being denied to Arabs? So when we begin, let's begin with something like the demonstration tomorrow, the demonstration on September 13th. And we have to continue to demonstrate. September 11th, the week of September 11th, gives us an incredible opportunity to show people who we are and what our values are. If we stay at home on September 11th, if we pretend like we don't exist for a whole week, then we're letting other people define us. We need to define who we are and what America is to us. So across this country, you're going to see Arab Americans and American Muslims that we work with in MPAC and AMC and CARE have programs that emphasize the fact that we are part of this country and we are going to defend the civil liberties of this country. We're holding signing of the constitutions. We're participating in the Freedom Fair down on the Mall. We have national programs all over the country, the interfaith dialogues, demonstrations and vigils. We have to be in the streets. We have to bring together with our neighbors this message to our leadership and say that there isn't a differentiation. We're all Americans. You can't say this is an American and this is not American because your hair is this way or you wear these clothes or because you speak with this kind of accent, you're less of an American than I am. My father is like Scott. My father still speaks broken English, but he also happens to speak 5 other languages. I don't know many Americans who can speak 2 languages, including his son. So let's remember, we have a lot to give to this country, and this country gains from who we are. So we don't have to be in the shadows. We don't have to hide. We are America. Here are 4 things you can do. 1, don't hide during September 11th. Talk to CARE, talk to AMC, talk to MPAC. Talk to ISNA, find out what's going on in your community, and create opportunities to reinforce the message, we are America and we stand for our civil liberties, number 1. Number 2, when was the last time you wrote a check to an organization that's working for you in terms of political action? I just had another group of journalists in my office from the Middle East, and they said, why can't you guys beat the Israeli lobby? Well, let me give you some examples. If you took all of the Arab groups and all of the Muslim groups in Washington, all of them, and you added up all their budgets, our total budgets for the 6 major organizations is $8 million. AIPAC's budget, one organization, is $72 million. Okay? We don't even support our own organizations. If we haven't responded to the calls from our organizations to support Earl Hilliard and Cynthia McKinney and David Kawas and all these people who are running because they're proud of their heritage and proud of who they are coming from the Arab world and Muslim world, then we're not fulfilling our responsibilities. So the second thing you can do is start writing checks to support candidates and support the organizations who support you. The third thing you can do is vote. The most intimidating thing in this country, the thing we have learned, and I've been in this business now 30 years working in Washington, is that when you come to a person and you're a constituent, you say to them, here are your choices. You can talk to us and have a dialogue and learn something, and we'll learn something from you, or we can take our vote away from you. That's why it's so important to identify yourselves as Muslims, or as Arabs, or as whatever group identity you have, because as a group you have power. As individuals you don't have power. You know, we have a problem in the Arab world, as you know, that everybody likes to be the Zaim. Everybody likes to know that if I give you $1, that somehow you're going to smile on me and I'm going to be a big guy. That dollar isn't worth anything unless you put it with 99 other dollars and they see something and they say, oh, there's a group out there. It's not this guy who's smiling at me and I'm going to pat him on the head and say, thank you very much, Mr. Arab American, now you can go home, and ignores me for the rest of the time he's in office. But if you come as a group and you say, here's our check as a group, and we're going to go out and work for you on the day, and then we're going to come to you the day after you're elected and talk to you about who's going to be appointed in your office to work with our community. And we're going to talk to you about laws that affect our community. And not just civil liberties laws, but education laws and Social Security and health. Then you're participating as Americans, and that's our job. Citizenship is not a passive occupation. Citizenship is a responsibility from God. It's in the Quran and it's in the Bible. That we have to serve as leaders, and you serve as leaders by being servants. And that's our third job. Get out the vote, work in elections, support candidates, and don't forget, after the election, go back and say, okay, we voted for you. Now, where's the trade-off? What do we get for it? Because that's what politics is about. It's a relationship. Build these relationships with your leaders. The fourth thing I would suggest is something that we did during the anti-Vietnam movement. Yes, I was against the Vietnam War. I know it's hard for you to believe. Most of you weren't even born then, but there was a war back then, in the 70s. One of the things we did is we adopted people of conscience. In other words, people who are conscientious objectors or people who are prisoners of war. We have a prisoner of war. His name is Yasser Hamdi. He's a Saudi American. He's being held in a brig in Norfolk. God bless George Dumar, the judge in Norfolk, who is resisting the federal government. He's an Arab American, which has nothing to do with it. But he's fighting the federal government, saying they have not proven this guy should be called an enemy combatant. They want to destroy his rights so that they can next month and next year destroy our rights. We have to adopt people like Yasser Hamdi and the detainees as prisoners of conscience and support them and tell our leaders, this is not America, this is not American, and they should support our civil liberties. So remember, we are not alone. Remember, this is our country, and remember, our future is in our hands. We should not give it to the bigots. We should look for our friends, and we should build the coalitions that will make us victorious. Thank you, and God bless you.
That is wonderful advice, my dear friends. I hope we are all taking note that we don't leave from here having heard these inspiring speakers and then go back to our normal routine of living within ourselves. Because September 11th, if it has done one thing for the Muslim American community, it has given us a stark wake-up call. That the responsibility of living our lives as true Muslims and as true Muslim Americans was upon ourselves. That we had to live by going outside our cocoons of existence that we had become used to. That we had to go out and live the message, the glorious message of Islam that was given to us, and present it by actually living it as true Muslims. And that, my dear friends, is the challenge of the hour. It was tremendously frustrating at these times, as I ran into a gentleman yesterday and I asked him about the community of friends from his area, how many others were coming, and believe it or not, he said that there were so many families who were afraid of coming to this convention this time because it was being held in Washington, D.C., because they were scared about what the message would be sent out to law investigating agencies. Can you imagine that? If each one of us were to adopt that approach, then we may as well close shop and go home, ladies and gentlemen. As Mr. AbiNader has indicated, this is our country. and the values that we bring, the principles that we live, we are uniquely responsible for living it and taking it out to the rest of the community, and that is where bridge building is so important. Now, let's move on to some practical actions that are being implemented. And this is very important for us to be aware of organizations such as the ACLU, which is always in the forefront of fighting violations of civil rights, and I don't need to talk to you about how important ACLU is. We are privileged to have with us Reginald Shuford. He is with the ACLU, the legal department, and he does complex constitutional and impact litigation in the area of civil rights and civil liberties. And in particular, he focuses in the areas of race and poverty. These days, he's involved in litigation aimed at challenging racial profiling, including driving while black or brown, and airport and pedestrian profiling. Mr. Shuford leads the National ACLU's office's litigation efforts in that regard. And recently, ACLU made good news in June 2002 when, in conjunction with colleagues around the country, he personally has filed 5 lawsuits against 4 major airlines alleging racial discrimination against men perceived to be Arab, Middle Eastern, or Muslim. He has made numerous appearances on television and radio talk shows, and he should be able to bring us a unique perspective from the legal trenches as to what is happening and how we can participate and support such efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, Reggie Shuford.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be among you this evening, as well as a privilege to be among such esteemed panelists. Both personally, on behalf of the ACLU, I'm really honored to be among you this evening. The catalog of horrors visited upon this community is well known to all of us since September 11th. This evening, I'd like to share with you just some of the work of the ACLU designed to preserve and protect the civil liberties that we've all grown accustomed to having and deserving on a daily basis. Before doing that, though, I'd like to introduce 2 colleagues who also work in this area at the ACLU. King Downing, is King Downing in the room? Well, King is the coordinator of the ACLU's campaign against racial profiling. I know that Dahlia Hashad is here. Dahlia is a Muslim lawyer recently hired to work on post-9/11 backlash against targeted communities. So we're happy to have her on board, and I look forward to working with Dahlia. And I'm sure you'll be hearing and seeing a lot more of her tonight, for the rest of the weekend, and throughout the next several months. To say that the ACLU has been busy since 9/11 may be the understatement of the year. John Ashcroft has kept us on our toes. Like everyone, we at the ACLU were horrified by the events of 9/11. Being just minutes away from the World Trade Center, our first concern was for the safety of our fellow colleagues, our families, and our friends. We were fortunate to have suffered no casualties. But we had very little time to appreciate our good fortune. Before our communications infrastructure, that is our telephone system and our email system, were back up and running, we had to act. We were required to turn our attention to threats to civil liberties being announced on a daily basis almost from the Bush-Ashcroft team. Were it not for our D.C. legislative office, which did and continue to have communications infrastructure, we would have been in major trouble. Then and now, our D.C. legislative office has done work which remains unsurpassed in terms of reviewing, analyzing, and challenging where appropriate legislative and executive measures which would undercut the very liberties which serve as a bedrock of this country. From the very beginning, our message has been safe and free. all of us, every single person in this room, every single person in this country, want to be safe. We believe, though, that it's not necessary to give up freedoms and civil liberties and civil rights in the name of so-called safety and security. You can do them at the same time. As with all of our work, the work post 9/11 has been three-pronged: public education, legislation, and litigation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in each of those areas. On what seems like a daily basis, especially right after 9/11, and even continuing today, and especially given the passage of the U.S. Patriot Act, our communications department in the area of public education has issued press releases urging the administration that while acting to protect us, that it be mindful and careful to preserve our freedoms. The press releases from our communications department have challenged everything from the draconian fingerprinting and tracking policy that would track every visitor and immigrant to the United States, to the policy under which even American citizens can be deemed enemy combatants and denied their fundamental constitutional right to a lawyer. The communications department, in conjunction with other departments, also created Know Your Rights publications, which I have here, which is available this evening in 7 languages. It's in English, of course, but also Arabic, Urdu, Punjabi, Farsi, Spanish, and Hindi. Again, when this panel is done, you can get your copy, or I can direct you to our website where you can get them online. Our legislative office hit the ground running on the very day of 9/11 and has not stopped since then. Fearing charges of unpatriotism, many members of Congress and the Senate behind the scenes contacted our legislative office to ask, what can we do to slow down this very hyper Ashcroft, who is so desirous of undermining all of our civil liberties, so interested in presenting an issue, an image of fighting the war, the so-called war against terrorism, that he won't hesitate to trample upon the civil rights and civil liberties of everybody in this room and indeed other immigrants around the country. But they were afraid to be public about their concerns because, again, they feared being labeled unpatriotic. So secretly, on a frequent basis, they contacted our legislative office, and that office provided insight as to how to contain, to the extent possible, some of the more draconian measures that were coming out of the Ashcroft and Bush administration. So while the Patriot Act is scary indeed, it would have been a lot more scary were it not for the behind the scenes and indeed even the public work of our legislative office. It would be foolish of me to try to tell you everything that the legislative office did, so what I will do instead is to commend you to our website, which is www.aclu.org/safe-and-free. That's www.aclu.org/safe-and-free. And there you'll find all of our press releases, legislative documents, and testimony, and reports related to the war on terror, including reports by the legislative office entitled Insatiable Appetite, the Government's Demand for New and Unnecessary Powers After September 11th. Again, this is on our website. Another report by both our president and executive director is called Civil Liberties After 9/11, the ACLU Defends Freedom, a Historical Perspective on Protecting Liberty in Times of Crisis. The website also includes features on surveillance powers, again, the Right to Know pamphlet that I just talked about, national ID cards, fingerprinting, Operation Tips. There are also various action alerts which allow you to log onto the website and send immediate and direct emails to your representatives in Congress. The ACLU also has been involved in major litigation since 9/11. We filed 2 lawsuits challenging secret deportation hearings and 2 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits seeking the names and other information about the men who are being detained. At the lower levels of the courts, we've won all that litigation, and indeed, even at the Sixth Circuit, we recently won the case saying that these immigration and deportation hearings have to be public. The administration, of course, has appealed some of these decisions, and so some of them still remain to be heard at the appellate level or at the U.S. Supreme Court. In June, as was mentioned, I led a group of other lawyers around the country in suing 4 major airlines, American, Continental, Northwest, and United, alleging racial discrimination. And what they did was after these men had passed all security checkpoints and security screening and were allowed on the airplanes, fellow passengers or other members of the flight crew expressed that they were quote unquote uncomfortable with these men's presence on the airplanes. And so the men were forced to get off the airplane. And we believe that's pure and simple discrimination. Were it to happen to any other group in this country, the ACLU would have challenged it, and so we feel it's our obligation in this case as well to challenge it and to get it to stop. We also filed another airline case in Illinois. It's called Kokab v. Harris, and that lawsuit challenges a very, very invasive body search of a Muslim woman as she was trying to fly at Chicago's O'Hare. That case is in discovery now. We filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles, the airline screeners case, challenging a recently passed law that says that only American citizens can be screeners at airports. Again, we won that case too at the trials, the earliest stage. We defeated the motion to dismiss, and it's likely that case will be going to appeal very shortly. Thank you. Another case I'm sure you guys have heard of is the one involving the Muslim woman who lives in Florida who refused to remove her head covering when she was required to have her driver's license picture taken. So we're litigating that case as well. We've considered litigation in several other areas, including the quote-unquote voluntary questioning of thousands of Muslim and Arab men by the Department of Justice. We are considering still litigation challenging the so-called absconder apprehension initiative, which prioritizes the deportation of 6,000 Muslim and Arab visa violators. When there are over 300,000 immigration visa violators in the country, the focus has been, unfortunately, on this community, and we think there's a problem with that, and we are looking for ways to challenge that. We're also, thank you. We're also looking at ways very actively to challenge the manner in which Hamdi and Jose Padilla are being held with very little of their constitutional rights accorded them. It's a difficult challenge, but we're looking very seriously at what we can do to make sure that they, like all American citizens, are afforded the constitutional rights that everybody else is entitled to. Let me close, and then I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have. I've again been working on the issue of racial profiling and racial discrimination since 9/11, in particular in the area of airline actions and activity. And I've, of course, read a lot of horror stories. One, I won't go into detail about it, but one man, his name is Samir Abdel Ghani. He's the owner of a Rainbow travel company in Anaheim, California, said something that was really quite simple, but I think it made the point. He said, in response to all the extra scrutiny that he and others have endured since 9/11, he said, I'm very proud as an American citizen and as a Muslim. And to me, that makes the point. Being American and being Muslim are not mutually exclusive, nor is being safe and being free. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a couple of minutes, as I just wrap up the session, we will open ourselves up to questions and answers, and there are microphones. There's one out here in this corridor, so those who want to ask questions, if you would be kind enough.
Proud as an American citizen and as a Muslim. And to me, that makes the point. Being American and being Muslim are not mutually exclusive, nor is being safe and being free. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a couple of minutes, as I just wrap up the session, we will open ourselves up to questions and answers, and there are microphones. There's one out here in this corridor, so those who want to ask questions, if you would be kind enough, and if we could impose on you to line up there, we will take questions in the order in which you are there. And if you also want to write your questions and pass them on, we'd be happy to entertain those too. But as I close, ladies and gentlemen, it's very important for us to keep in mind that as we talk about Muslims, Muslim Americans, and the issue of civil rights, from the religious perspective, we have to recognize that this is somewhat of an anachronism, because Islam is a system that is built upon the precept of respecting rights at every step of one's life. Rights that are owed to the Creator and rights that are owed to the creation. And our salvation as Muslims is based on how diligently and steadfastly we discharge these rights, which are so clearly defined by God through His revealed word and through His chosen messengers. So the reason I make that point is, as the anniversary of September 11th approaches, I think at least two of our speakers touched on this point. It behooves us to stand up and not try to be hidden away from public view, but to come forward and speak out against injustice. We are going to be speaking out against oppression of the rights of Americans. Muslims happen to be a part of that American culture and society. Muslims are going to be speaking up without qualification when we see injustice and suffering across the world and across our country. And if you will likely get the question, as I get posed the question all the time, when I question the actions of my government, am I being unpatriotic? And what I say to that is, it is unpatriotic for me to not speak up as an American when I see social injustice. And I say that, and I think every one of us should say that it is unpatriotic to not cry foul when our government takes action that blatantly is wrong and unjust within this country or outside this country. That is unpatriotic. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us become informed and truly understand what is going on with the civil rights situation. Contact our speakers, get their contact addresses, check out their websites, become aware of what is happening in the areas of racial profiling, fingerprinting, infiltration of areas of religious worship. Become aware of how the law investigatory agency techniques are being expanded, and then become involved by taking action, speaking out as an American, as a Muslim, as a patriotic citizen of this country against all of these actions that are being taken. And that is when, individually and collectively, inshallah, we will bring about the change that is so essential in these critical times. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, inshallah, we'll begin with the questions. We have a sister, and then sister, if you have a particular question to be addressed to a particular member, do so. If not, we'll make that call ourselves, inshallah.
My question is directed to every one of the panelists. I'm from Long Island, New York, and in my community, racial profiling is a very thorny issue. And even though we all know it doesn't work, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, obviously did not fit the profile. Many people see it as a necessary evil. And my question is, in order to preserve our national security, do you see another viable alternative to racial profiling?
I certainly do. I mean, I just think it's a fallacy to accept the argument that you have to engage in racial profiling to achieve security. In fact, I think racial profiling undermines that. One thing that it does is it alienates the very people who might have some information, who might want to share it, but who won't come forward because they're pissed off at the way their communities are being treated. Number two, what needs to be the focus is behavior. Behavior, behavior, behavior. If somebody is behaving suspiciously, then by all means, do whatever you need to get that person off the airplane or out of the country or whatever. But simply to focus on appearance or ethnicity or national origin is counterproductive, it's inefficient, and it just doesn't work. Behavior, behavior, behavior. Not race, not ethnicity, not national origin.
Assalamu alaikum. I have been an interfaith activist for the last 15-20 years. And I have seen that in this situation at present, where Muslims are the targets, where Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir, Palestine. And I have been visiting the churches. They have asked me to come and explain. And the question they asked me is, why do you hate us? Second question they asked me is, what should America do now? And we have not answered all this. We are expressing all our frustrations among ourselves. We don't have a newspaper. We don't have a TV channel. What are we doing? And this is a Christian nation, and we have interfaith dialogues, and the majority of them are Christians, and this is a democracy, and they are not able to ask their government why it has not helped, why it's not urging the Security Council to implement the resolutions. And I told the churches and all those who visited our center, Islamic Information Center, that it is not enough for America to be only a military and economic power. It has to be a just power in the present context. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. Those are good comments.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ghulam Akhtar. I represent Bangladesh USA Human Rights Group. Brother and sister, I think our problem just started. We are not hitting for the solution of the problem. You know, after the Pearl Harbor, all the Japanese were interned. And it took at least 4 or 5 years to things got straightened. But in our case, I do not see it will be straightened within 20 years. Why? You know, none of the Muslims around here are terrorists or they have designed or done something there. Back home, our country without bad human rights, with corruptions, with fanatism, they are the breeding ground of all sorts of bad things. And they are coming over here, doing something, and we are all blamed. But what is our responsibility? I am from Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, the Supreme Court given a verdict that women will get only 3 months alimony. Men, women, we tell, in Islam, women are equally respected. So I would ask your panelists that why, please. Oh, sorry, no, because I am very, very excited.
I understand. If you could ask the question, we'll use the time.
Question is how to educate our back home and their people not to train people to hate America. We do not hate America. And what should we do back home? We don't have any power. Our leaders do not listen to us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what we will do is we will restrict the answers to the issues that are very pertinent to this session. You have a very important question, brother, but perhaps we can address that at some other session. Yes, brother.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdul Rahim from Greenville, North Carolina. And recently, this past week, there was an article in the paper, I think it was an AP article, pertaining to that Americans are willing to give up some of their civil liberties, mainly their First Amendment rights. And this was a poll taken that 2/3 of Americans believe in this here. I forget your name, but the one who represents Mr. Zogby, I think they have a poll situation. And what is your findings? What are your findings on that particular situation?
What we have found is that across the board, Arabs and Muslims in this country are willing to be subject to more scrutiny and to give up some degree of their rights if it's done respectfully and if it's done in a way that doesn't make them feel that somehow they're being discriminated against more than anyone else. So I think we're willing to play our role, but not to the point where there's abuse of our communities. Our last poll shows about 58% of our communities say we expect more scrutiny. We're willing to put up with it, but it has to be done in a respectful manner.
One point that the sister said, I forget where she was from, but we are a minority. Muslims are a minority here. And I know our hands are tied, but, you know, inshallah, one day we will become a majority in some sense where we can have the media on our side, and maybe many Muslims can invest in the media, and that way the people will know that we're not here to, we hate them or anything like that.
Let me just say in response to your first question also that I think that with all this polling, I'm sometimes a little suspicious, because I think that sometimes the very poll that you cited really means that certain Americans are willing to give up civil liberties of other Americans. And so we have to be mindful of that.
Let me address your issue about the media, because obviously I deal with the media all the time, and if any of you have a sense of humor, you might remember I was on Crossfire last week with Sandy Rios, who was talking about our responsibility as Muslims and how we ought to change the world, exactly the question you were asking, and our friend from Bangladesh was asking about how do we change people back home. Let me be very frank about it. We are responsible for the media. In other words, unless we speak up and we let the media know in a constructive way where they're wrong, they'll continue to be wrong. Believe me, when I started in this business in 1974, as a young guy I had just spent a year in Yemen, and I came back to the United States, and I watched the media, and I said, oh, I can't believe the images they have of Arabs and Muslims. Believe me, it's a lot better now, 25 years later, than it was then, in terms of school books, in terms of PBS. I mean, we're going to have a program on Muslims next week on PBS. It's going to be shown all around the country. But that's because people start and they work one year in and year out to change the minds of the people who control the media in this country. As long as you allow someone else to define who we are, they're going to go ahead and do it. But unless you start writing the letters and meeting with the people and talking with them and literally living your life in a way that is, as Kareem said, is responsible for your community, someone else is always going to define you. And so we need to do that work. We can't allow other people to do it because we're going to always be on the short end of that.
Brother, go ahead with your question, and after that I'll take two questions that are written down here.
My name is Mazen Kudaim from Chicago. I just would like to have the panel opinion about how effective, litigation is after legislation is in order there and quote-unquote the damage is done. I could think of, a case in Philadelphia where a public school teacher was fired because of her, Islamic dress. And they used the legislation passed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania almost 100 years ago, which was aimed at Catholic nuns, essentially, teaching in public schools. So that was done 100 years ago. It obviously was a prejudice to legislation there, but still continued to be in the book, and ironically was used against another ethnic group 100 years down the line. So how much can we do with legislation with the litigation after the damage is done, like the Patriotic Act?
Very legitimate question, and obviously it's something that concerns us. I mean, our goal when the Patriot Act was threatened prior to being passed was to halt it and to keep it from being passed. And we obviously failed, but I think while the Patriot Act is a horrible piece of legislation, it would have been worse had we not done the work that we did prior to its passage. But we think litigation is effective, and a lot of that remains to be seen because we're in the early stages. But to the extent that we're challenging some of these draconian measures and some of these measures which are clearly discriminatory and unconstitutional, that's certainly our responsibility. And I think it gives pause to those who would next seek to have legislation passed that would be similarly unconstitutional. But we don't rely solely on litigation, obviously, because, a lot of our judges are not necessarily friendly to us. So, again, the ACLU and many other organizations who do this type of work really do sort of equally use a three-pronged approach, and that is public education and getting the information out to the communities so that they could be active as well in contacting their representatives, etc., doing legislative lobbying, trying to prevent passage of legislation, but failing that, working to keep it contained post-passage, and then also litigation to challenge the most egregious of those measures.
Reggie, there's Scott, are you adding to that? Please do.
Like my colleagues, I have no legal expertise, but I've noticed just as a layperson that the litigation has at least provided courts with an opportunity to have a voice in all of this. And so there have recently been two judges that have spoken out. One who said democracy dies behind closed doors. And at least that makes the newspaper, and perhaps that makes people who are otherwise inclined not to raise an eyebrow, to raise that eyebrow. And again, it's a step in the right direction.
Sure.
There's one other piece, since we're doing commercials here, www.aaiusa.org, that's our website. On the right-hand side, it says things that you can do. One of them is a resolution that can be passed by your local town. 8 cities across the United States have already adopted resolutions saying, we will not support the USA Patriot Act in our town. This was passed by city leaders. In other words, they're saying we respect civil rights of our people here, and so we're not going to let this community be abused by federal statutes. Get this piece of legislation. It's a simple resolution. It's on our website. You can download it. Take it to your city council. Say, pass this. Take it to your county council. Say, pass this. There's no reason why you can't do that. You also find on there statements of principles which can be adopted by your local organizations, by your local school boards, by your local civic organizations that are very similar. They're non-legislative, but they say the same thing, that we stand for these principles. Every time something like this passes, every time you adopt something like this, you create, as Scott said, a media opportunity. And media opportunities are the collective education of our communities. So go to the website, get these down, and here's another thing you can do. Have your community stand for civil liberties.
Would you be kind enough to repeat that again, please?
AAIUSA.org.
Thank you. Reggie, there's a question here for you, and then I'll get to you, sir. Citizenship applicants are now required to reveal the organizations to whom they have given donations to. What are the implications of giving such information from a civil rights perspective? Would you want to comment on that?
All I'll say is that, that scares us. I mean, we think that is information that is private and personal and should be protected by the Constitution. And I hopefully, when the right case comes to us, we'll challenge it. But we are, the ACLU is completely opposed to having to provide information like that.
Reggie, one related question is the ACLU working on anything with respect to the Muslims who've been locked up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and the rights that they're suffering?
I can't say specifically since I'm not involved in that, but I believe that we are. But I can't say, I'm not sure. To the extent that they're not, do you know, Dahlia?
Mr. Elia, would people be able to log on to your site and get some information about that? Is there a place where people, because that is a very pervasive question. Very good. The answer there was that people can log on to the ACLU.org site and get general information in that area. There's a lot of research being done at the ACLU, and some action is likely to be taken in the near future. And Scott wanted to, Reggie.
I guess Dahlia was saying that we're at the very initial stages of doing work and research in that area. So that particular information wouldn't be on the website as of yet, but I think probably in the very near future it will be.
I just want to say we also have to pay close attention to rules like that, because that who have you written checks to is a damned if you do, damned if you don't question. It's like, do you still beat your wife? If you answer yes or no, either way. If you fill it out and there happens to be an Islamic relief organization, then that will red flag you for people, you know. If you don't fill it out, you know, because you feel it's a matter of private conscience, you know, and someone decides to bring you in for questioning, and then they know that you have contributed, then they've got you for, you know, lying and being deceitful and not putting that on. And I think we really, you know, have to sort of bring these things out into the light and refuse to accept them.
Absolutely.
Sir, you're on.
Good evening. My name's Wiley Pickett. I have a question for Mr. Shuford. One of the strengths of the United States is the basic fundamental freedoms. And I'm an old timer, and I grew up in the United States, and actually haven't experienced any racial profiling, probably because people can pronounce my last name, and I don't wear a hijab. But my question is, there's a new term now called enemy combatant, and when I grew up over the years, we called people like that traitors, but even traitors were allowed representation and open trials. And I wanted to know what the source of the authority for the term legal combatant comes from.
You know, I actually have not done much work in that area. I know there are others in my office who are looking at it very closely. So I really don't know the answer to that, but I know that it's not a new term. I know that it is several decades old at best, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that even then, historically, those deemed as such have had broader rights than those are people today. And I mean, we are seriously looking to challenge that, and I hope that we'll do it shortly. It's not a new phenomenon, a new term, but somewhere in the history books and the legislative documents, it exists. I'm sorry?
It is tied back, yeah.
Germany, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's World War II, and it's related to, I think, a couple German people who turned up on the shores of the United States and landed in New York somewhere or something like that. So it may in fact be, it may be a part of case law as opposed to legislative authority, actually. But I'm not certain.
Sir, you're on next.
Yeah, I think Mr. Alexander brought it up specifically, and Mr. Nader also touched on it, but the idea of the politicization of evangelicals in the United States as far as rallying behind the Israeli cause and giving support to that, and actually saying not to underestimate the positions of Pat Robertson, Benny Hinn, because they are very politically motivated. And well, I was just my question would be to further explain it. I know people outside of the Beltway, I mean, it's somewhat evident in the Beltway that these people are political, but outside the Beltway, most Americans aren't aware of that, and a lot of these groups influence media coverage and the people that go on media to explain the Middle East coverage. I'd just like to get a further response, sir.
Yes, I think you make a very good point. Just to expand a little bit on what I was saying, I think that some of this rhetoric that is being, I think, a bit disingenuously presented as interreligious polemic, what one religious community can accept about the other. I don't really think, on one level, it might masquerade as that. But on another level, I think it's feeding a propaganda machine. And when you hear people talk about, I'm not sure who it was that, if it was Benny Hinn, I have it somewhere in my notes, I think it was Benny Hinn, who was talking about, a war against God and God's people. And God and God's people were the people of the West, and primarily Jews and Christians. And the way some of this Christian right rhetoric is sizing up is that the Muslims are, astaghfirullah, the Antichrist, who are arraying themselves against the forces of good for a final cataclysmic upheaval that will bring about the end of history. This is extremely frightening and extremely disturbing. And I think people need to know that even some of these groups' theologies about the end times are many of these groups are pre-dispensationalist millennialists, which means, I believe, that they're praying for, or they're waiting for Armageddon because they believe that the righteous will be raptured and will not undergo any of the trials and tribulations of that kind of cataclysmic upheaval. Now, again, if that's just sort of religious rhetoric on the fringe somewhere that has no real impact or relationship to power and policy, all right, we just sort of maybe smile at it and let it go. But I think it's something very different.
Scott and John, let me interject with a question related to that. Isn't it important for us as Muslim Americans, as well as Americans who are concerned about what's happening, to challenge these statements regardless of the political motivations that may be behind them? Because if we don't start challenging them at a grassroots level, then we cannot start bringing about the change in perceptions and mindset that is so essential. I can tell you that based on the remarks from Franklin Graham, for instance, in the dialogue that I have with my Christian friends, I just had a point-blank question for them. I asked them, do you support these anti-Semitic remarks? That got a conversation going, and of course, nobody in their right mind could argue in support of those remarks. But it is important to raise that question, ladies and gentlemen. That's why I think we have to be informed about who said what, and then confront the people in a very legitimate, modest, and courteous manner.
Yes, legitimate, modest, open, but I think we have to be firm. When Ari Fleischer was asked what the president's reaction was, Ari Fleischer is the press secretary for the White House, to the statement of Jerry Vines about the Prophet Muhammad just before the Southern Baptist Convention. He said the president disagrees. And then he said, we reaffirm the president's statement that Islam is a religion of peace. Well, if you're a private citizen and you say, I disagree, that may be sufficient. But if you're the leader of a nation that is supposed to stand up for tolerance and the rights of all different people and religious freedom and all, and you've got someone saying the kinds of things in the spirit that Jerry Vines said, then I think you need a much stronger response from the president. And I also think the president needs to be asked why after that comment was made, when he addressed the Southern Baptist Convention, he didn't raise the issue.
Let me take it one step further. When I went to college, and I know there are some college students here, without any encouragement from anybody, I did a certificate in comparative religions, in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I would encourage those of you who have the interest to represent your community that you become more proficient in understanding other religions. You're in a Christian country. And so to understand Christianity is important because you need to be able to, if you go to France, you speak French, you'll get more than if you don't speak the vocabulary. And so I think having people like Scott is terrific because they can help mentor in terms of the kinds of issues that we can identify and use to help move a dialogue along. But I think just to argue from a point of view that, well, you're wrong and I'm right, is to be like them. If we can say to them, one of our greatest arguments, if you ever watch us on the shows, is that we just look at the people, who are making all the criticism and say, do you know any Muslims? And they look at us and say, well, why do we have to know Muslims? Well, obviously, that shows right away their ignorance. You see, and that's very powerful. If they say to someone starts criticizing Islam, say to them, excuse me, have you ever been to a mosque? Have you ever been to one of these madrasas where they teach the hatred of America? Have you ever spoken with a woman who wears a hijab to see that she doesn't have fangs or horns or what it is? And they get embarrassed. And I have to say, though, that if they turn it around and say, have you ever been to a Christian church? If you're being critical of Christianity or Christian precepts, you have to be able to say, maybe not, but I have Christian friends and I talk to people about religion. It's more powerful when you can speak the same vocabulary. And it's more powerful when you can shame them by showing the depth of their ignorance. But simple question, do you know any Muslims? Have you ever been to a mosque? Can you name the 5 pillars of Islam? Just basic stuff. And if they don't know that, then what's the dialogue? But then on the other hand, you should know who Moses is, and you should know what Jesus stands for, and you should know the Ten Commandments. Because then you can say to them, well, your own book says kiza, kiza, kiza. And how does that square with what you're saying here today? Knowledge is power.
Good evening. The question that I have is ever since September 11th and the issue of civil liberties and civil rights have come up, the argument killer all the time from proponents of these erosions are that in times of war, the President of the United States has the right to suspend the Constitution, and they cite, I believe, Abraham Lincoln and Harry S. Truman as that. And if I could get your response to that. The second question I had is the situation that the Muslim and Arab communities are in right now. How much does that parallel the plight of African Americans in the 60s and immigrants such as the Irish Americans and Italian Americans who happen to be Catholic previously?
I think my answer is pretty much like the same to both your questions, which is these issues are all very cyclical, and there's historical precedent for it. So what is happening now has in fact happened before, has happened to other communities. It certainly has happened to African Americans. It's interesting because since September 11th, people have really been interested in what African Americans have to say about the issue of racial profiling. And I think initially some African Americans responded sort of with relief. They said, finally, for the first time in history, someone else is being targeted. But I think, though, upon reflection, that when you start eroding civil liberties of one group, it's the next least popular group whose civil rights and civil liberties are going to be taken away the next time. So when people say it's a president's prerogative to strip away rights in times of war, we say no, what it is most important at that time to adhere to constitutional standards so that decades down the line and in the future, we don't in fact have to be ashamed of the way that we behaved. And in the instance, for example, of interned Japanese Americans, have to apologize to them for the way that we treated them and paid them millions and millions of dollars. So no, I don't think it's an executive prerogative to strip away civil liberties at all. I think it's quite the contrary. And I think that what we have to do is insist that constitutional rights be adhered to and that we step it up a notch when we are called upon to challenge those measures that would strip away those rights.
Again, not speaking from any jurisprudential expertise, but I would also, when you look back in the history at these other occasions that Reggie was making reference to, you'll see that an important dynamic in preserving civil liberties, yes, it is in the Constitution that some of these things can be suspended in times of national emergency, but an important dynamic that has kept this country a place where these liberties are preserved is pushing back, and pushing back very hard. So, the executive branch of the government may say, well, we feel we need to suspend these, and then that's why it's important for the communities that are suffering the abuse and the indignities, and for others who support them, and for agencies like the ACLU and others to really push back very hard.
And not only
pushback is a part of our patriotic nationalistic duty. That's very important to remember.
Right, and keep in mind also that we are three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. So the president it's exceptional is the case where he can, of his own will, do something in the name of war or otherwise. There has to be a check and balance system. And that means that when you're trying, for example, to strip away a citizen's rights, the court should have something to say about it. Or if the president is going to declare war against some country, the Congress should have some say about it. It's not only executive that should be controlling in these times.
Well, and in the interest of justice and rights that we are talking about after this question, if with the permission of the others, may I request the two sisters to come up so that we may take the questions from them a little bit ahead of the three gentlemen there, if I could. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, my name is Akbar Khan. I'm from New Jersey. And my question is concerning persuading individuals to come out and report acts of civil injustices. For example, we all know that what's reported is the tip of the iceberg, but there's plenty, I am sure, of acts in which civil liberties were trampled upon individuals. And I can think of 2 cases amongst my friends who are both professionals that had incidents in which they, at least that I feel, in which they have some degree of latitude to react, but in fact they didn't, out of fear perhaps of professional repercussions or whatever. But how do you persuade an individual to speak up? Because it does involve a lot of courage, and there could be some negative consequences perhaps.
Who wants to take that?
We get requests all the time for, and New Jersey is a good example, for saying, hey, can you get us somebody who's been a victim of a hate crime or someone who's faced discrimination or one of the families of the detainees? And of course there's great reluctance in the communities to do that. I think that the one strength of Islam is the sense of community, and I think if people understand that there's a community supporting them, that they are not going to be left out on a plank by themselves. And also I think it's important, 1, to have community support, but 2, to get good legal advice. One of the things that will kill you is not being able to frame the situation in a way that's plausible and credible and has evidentiary links to it so that people can say, aha, there is something substantial here. This is not because of something the person smoked the night before. So I think it's very critical that you build community support and you get good legal support, and those 2 things can make a person feel less reluctant. I think that because it's so personal, we can't just say, hey, it's your responsibility. Because there is a fear element there. There is an intimidation element here. But we do have laws in this country. And we do have, I think, a collective sense among the ethnic communities in particular that civil liberties are under attack. And so if people see as a person they're part of a larger challenge, then I think they'll be more willing and they'll be less reluctant. But there's no foolproof way to do it.
Right. And I agree wholeheartedly. But the airline discrimination cases that I mentioned earlier that we filed in June, people came, first of all, they had to know that there was a safe place where they could go to announce and voice their concerns in the first place. So, obviously Arab American organizations, their existence and their vitality is extremely important. So people need to know that there are places to go and that when they get there, they won't be treated with hostility, as opposed to perhaps going to a police department and not being responded to very well. But then secondly, as John was saying, it is very important to provide legal advice. So when people came to us saying, I was kicked off of this airplane, what are my rights? Can they do that? We had to know how to be able to respond to them. And even when we mentioned that there were legal obstacles to take into consideration, they also had to know that there were other sort of non-legal things that they might have to contend with. For example, one of our clients' wife worked at the airline that kicked him off the airplane. And legitimately, he wanted to know from us whether there could be repercussions for her job. And as much as we wanted to say they can't do it, well, the reality is when it comes to employment, employees have very few rights. So as long as it's not sort of blatantly discriminatory, they in fact could have possibly have done something with her to make her time at work much more difficult. So although we were very much motivated to represent this guy, we couldn't in good faith do it without telling him, number one, not the obstacles he would face legally, but also what might happen sort of non-legal in terms of people somehow getting his name, his contact information, and prank calls, what have you. All of those things were possibilities. Fortunately, he said, what happened to me was so humiliating that I'm going to stand up. I've discussed this with my family, and we want to go forward. So that's what's happening. And because he's gone forward and the 4 other plaintiffs have gone forward with their litigation, other people now feeling like the community is out there and that they're not alone in doing this are also trying to get their rights vindicated as well.
Sister, and it goes without saying, it's so important. That's why for all of us to go beyond our regular organizations we support, to support organizations such as the ACLU, such as our Arab American institutions, because that is where the strength is going to come from when hopefully you won't ever need it, but if you do, that's where the support is going to come from. Yes, sister.
Well, before I raise my question, I'd like to thank the panelists. And my question has to do with something that I saw Peter Jennings say a few days ago, that incumbent Cynthia McKinney had been defeated, and he stated that she had disputed opinions about Middle East policy, and she was defeated by a candidate who had strong support by the pro-Israeli lobby. My first question is why you think, I have opinions of my own, but I'd like to hear why you think he stated that in that way, or why that was scripted to him that way, and also what we can do as citizens to support candidates like Cynthia McKinney before we reach that long-term goal of also having, a $72 million budget, which you spoke of, what we can do as constituents and non-constituents to further their cause.
John, you want to take that?
The Arab and Muslim communities were pulled into the Hilliard and McKinney campaigns, unfortunately. These were not good candidates. These were not strong candidates. Both of them would have been defeated by any good opposition. But knowing this, the pro-Israeli lobby took advantage of the fact that these were weak candidates, and they found young, attractive African Americans to oppose them. And it is creating quite a rift, as you know, within the Jewish black communities, voting communities, because the blacks are saying, why should the Jews be picking who the black members of Congress should be? So there is a problem there that's well documented in the press. McKinney said it because it was true. I mean, she was targeted by the pro-Israeli lobby because of her stand vis-a-vis the Palestinian situation in particular, and also other actions she had taken. But just like Earl Hilliard, she brought baggage with her, and it was that baggage and a crossover vote in both races from Republican voters who switched. They could do it. It's an open primary down there. They could vote as Democrats that really defeated her and also defeated Earl Hilliard. We have to be more strategic in not backing into races. And both the Muslim and Arab American community were backed into these races. We were dragged into these races. But I can say we performed really well. We raised lots of money. A lot of Arab Americans and American Muslims were in the districts, both of them particularly in the McKinney race, working to get out the vote. We did a lot of voter registration down there. We were actually driving vans, and I'm talking about all of our communities, worked very, very hard. But as I said, the thing was the odds were stacked against us. There are races, though. Chicago's a good example. Pennsylvania's a good example. New Jersey's a good example, where we do have races and where we have the numbers to make a difference. Those are the kinds of races we need to go after to show that when it's a level playing field, we can get out the vote as well as anybody else. But in those situations, unfortunately, there was more going against us than just the fact that they supported Palestinians.
Next sister, please. And sir, thank you for allowing her ahead of the queue.
Thank you very much for the panel discussion. My question relates to 9/11, and no writing that I ever read in Islam, and no Muslim I ever met in my entire life would ever advocate the terrorist act that occurred on 9/11. Obviously, some political agenda was forwarded. My question is, has there been any Muslim group or even objective group that's taken the initiative to perform their own research, to analyze every person who was on the plane, their backgrounds and their skills, to verify who performed the terrorist act on 9/11? And isn't it our responsibility to do our own research? And are there any plans for us to research the way I'm suggesting?
I think that's a good question. I don't know if I can impose on the panelists to answer that, but perhaps we can take that over to our organizations and make sure somebody does do that. Good question. I mean, you're more than welcome to make a comment, Scott.
I think it's a good question and perhaps a good initiative, as long as folks are willing to accept an answer that they weren't looking for. You see, and that goes back to the issue of self-criticism. Whether you have met Muslims or not who would do such things, there are Catholics who would do such things. I've not met them, but I know there are. And I think that's what we have to be willing to admit, and it's with that admission that we can sort of go forward in making sure that these folks don't sort of seize the day in terms of the discourse and political action and driving what we do as societies.
That's the antithesis of Islam. And I'm wondering, is there any group who would take that initiative?
Well, I mean, if you look back at there was a panel early this morning on the history of extremism in Islam, of ghulu, you see, and the gentleman who made the first presentation said, it begins with the Khawarij, you see, who were a group who, the Khawarij believed that their assassination of Sayyid Ali was legitimate. They believed that he was a kafir, astaghfirullah. That was their opinion. What the Muslim community at large said was, no, we don't accept that. That is too extreme, that is too radical. And so we draw the line. And if you go beyond that line, you're really exceeding the boundaries of legitimate Islam, that's where the word ghulu comes from, to go beyond the boundaries of what's legitimate. And so there'll always be disagreement and dissension within religious communities about where those boundaries are to be placed. But the people who are people of peace and people of justice have to make sure they're not silent. So they're usually the majority, and they have to make sure that majority voice is heard so that people outside the community know where the majority would draw the boundaries.
Thank you. Thank you, sister.
My question is directed to our esteemed friend from ACLU. To an earlier question, you had said behavior. But we have to be careful that we are not setting our own trap here. Because in order to detect a bad behavior, you have to profile the personality. And that becomes a very difficult situation. And I want to relate to you a briefing I recently got from Congressman John Culberson. He's the Aviation Security Committee, and the biggest profiling which goes on every day is at the airports. Currently, the airlines profile things, the baggage, and so forth. He's saying that his committee got experts from El Al airline, the Israelis, and saying they profile people so that they can detect behavior which is questionable. So now if we say behavior, are we setting up a trap that they will then say, the Bushites and the ultra-conservatives, extremists, that we have to profile people to find bad behavior? So I think we've got to, I'm seeking what is an alternate. Perhaps is it not behavior for detect the whole masses, but after something has been happened. So if you would clarify what position we will take. Thank you.
Yes, I'm not sure that I can clarify it any more than that, because I'm not sure that I accept that it is okay to profile people, particularly those who are innocent and have done nothing wrong. I just think that our country and our Constitution and our laws say that everybody is to be presumed innocent until they individually have done something wrong. And until they have done something that is objectively suspicious, then I don't think they should be subjected to law enforcement behavior. That's just my opinion, and I think that in the long run, that is the safest route to take. That until someone has acted in a way that is objectively suspiciously, then you should not be infringing upon their rights.
We are running short of time, but we will take those questions. The three gentlemen who are out there, please, if you...
My question is, I do not know how many of our elected representatives are attending this ISNA session, but a couple of months ago there was a Muslim demonstration and there was hardly any public representative there. And then we have anti-Muslim demonstration where the public representative was jostling with each other to attend. So what can we do as a community, plus also what is Islamic Society and other organizations doing about this to reverse this trend?
Behavior. Give money. Go to meetings with the candidates. Follow up with them after the election. Never let a month go by without a letter or a newspaper clipping or something going to your local officials. If you are invisible, they'll treat you like you're invisible. If you are in their face in a constructive way, they will pay attention to you. The reason people who support Israel are so strong in this country is because they have worked for it. They raise money, they get out the vote, they support candidates, they constantly barrage them with all their position papers. The Muslim and Arab American communities are far behind, but that doesn't mean we don't qualitatively have the ability to do the same thing. But we have to put some things behind us. One thing we have to put behind us is arguing over who's going to be the leadership. We have to understand that it's a collective leadership, and some people do some things better than others. And we have to work as a community, not as a group of individuals. Number two, we have to agree what the key issues are and how to prioritize those. We're not going to win every issue, but you got to do them in such a way that the people want to listen to you. I keep telling my friends in the Arab American community, if you go to a member of Congress and all you do is talk about Palestine every time you talk to them, they don't need to see you anymore because they know that's all you're going to talk about. But if you have a little more diversity, you talk about domestic issues, you talk about their campaigns, you talk about their kids, you talk about issues that are important to them in their committees, they're going to listen to you. But you've got to do some homework. You've got to understand who these people are. Public officials live to be re-elected. So you have to show them how important it is that they address you as a constituency. You can't do that as individuals. You do it as a collective. So use your organizations, use the community, use this identity that's growing in this country as a political force. And that's how you're going to get their attention. You're not going to get it by seeing them once every 2 years.
Yes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. Attending conferences and forums like these, I am left with the impression that the authority or the executive authority of the President of the United States of America is almost sacrosanct, that it cannot be challenged. In other words, if the President of this country decides that a situation arises whereby America is in a state of war with A, and that the President can use all these powers to incarcerate people without the requisite legal representations, etc. Why is it that the laws available today, especially with the groundswell of feelings in this country at the moment, that the President has gone a bit too far and his cabinet, especially if you bear in mind a lot of decisions have been made recently in the courts to rule, which ruled against the President, which ruled against John Ashcroft. You're aware of these instances. So why is it, bearing all these things in mind, that you do not try to exhaust all possibilities in the highest court, the United States Supreme Court, or in an international forum to focus this great, intrusion on people's rights? I'd like to know this, please. I know the problem you face. I remember when Salman Rushdie printed his nefarious book, and he was given protection by the British government. Yet the resentment by the Muslim and non-Muslim community was so great that Parliament in Britain is thinking now of bringing laws, making it an actionable offence to printing like that. So please, can you just give me why you have not exhausted all these possibilities? Thank you.
It took, if you remember, it took over 50 years for this country to apologize to the Japanese for what happened, the internment. I think we have to go back to our colleagues' remarks from the ACLU. This is a government of three parts: executive, legislative, and judicial. We need to work very hard on the legislative side to make our members of Congress more courageous. I mean, they were steamrolled on this Patriot Act. But they can go back and fix things. But we have to hold their feet to the fire. See, if we let them get away with it, if we don't say to them every day, your vote, your re-election depends on our vote, and our vote is not going to go to you unless you go into Congress and start changing some of these laws that are so bad for immigrants and for Muslims and for Arabs in this country. Unless they know there's a price for going along with the executive, they're going to continue to do it. And they've always done it that way, whether it's Social Security or foreign policy or anything else. The executive is supposed to provide the leadership. In days past, Congress in the 50s and the 60s, there was a counterbalance to the executive. But remember, they almost impeached Bill Clinton. You know, so the president is not sacrosanct. It really depends on the issues, and it depends on the courage of members of Congress, and it depends on the judiciary system. Now, the problem with the judiciary system, of course, is it can take years. And we're looking, I mean, you know, just to do discovery on a case can take 6 months to a year. So some of this stuff we're talking about today, we're not even going to see it in the court for another 2 years. But if we don't continue to push it, 2 years from now, we'll still be in the same place we are today. So I'm saying, number one, have patience with the judicial side and support those kinds of efforts. But number two, get more active politically and start getting legislators to understand the price they pay for not defending our civil liberties. And then the executive will pay attention. Why is Bush doing everything he's doing? Why is he pushing on Iraq? Because he wants to get reelected. If he understands that a war against Iraq is going to cost him his reelection, he's not going to go to war against Iraq. And what kind of war is it going to be anyhow against Iraq? We know what kind of war it's going to be. It's not a war, it's a shooting gallery.
Yes, sir. The last question, please.
Well, the last question, I'd like you to conclude by you looking at your crystal ball. Each one of you should have a crystal ball and tell us that we are a Muslim American. Some of us have lived here for 20 or 30 or 40 years, and at some point we feel we are threatened. Is this threat now we feel it suddenly because of religious conviction of a certain group in government, or because of frustration by the administration? They have not found any link among any Muslim in this country to those accused 19 hijacker and killer and murderer, or because of what? I mean, when is this going to end? I'd like you to look at in your crystal ball and tell us, and give us some comfort, please.
I'll tell you what, we'll end on that note with each speaker having 2 minutes. If all of us will bear for 6 minutes.
Three of them being student of history, student of law, student of religion, each one of them should give us a 2-minute answer. Thank you.
So if you will take on the challenge, Scott, you want to begin?
We should close with him.
I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't have that crystal ball. Maybe these two gentlemen sitting next to me do. But perhaps to make a link in terms of my closing comments with the important challenge that the gentleman questioner before you raised. I noticed when he was articulating his important question, he kept using the pronoun you. Why haven't you exhausted the... And I was wondering to myself, who is the you? And then thinking, maybe it's the ACLU, maybe it's the AAI. But in any case, what all of us have been saying up here is it's a we. Okay? And notwithstanding any particular conceptions of qadr wa qada, whether you're Mu'tazila or you're Ashari or whatever the case may be, I really think in some significant way, and I think the ethos of the Quran affirms this, we are presented with choices in our lives. And one of the choices that these fellows have been laying before us over and over again this evening is whether to act or not to act, and whether to act appropriately or whether to act inappropriately. And I'm hoping that the answer that's emerging in all of your minds and hearts is that we need to act, it's imperative, and we need to ask ourselves how to act most effectively and appropriately, and to act together and in concert and build, as Jean said, broad coalitions, build our coalitions as broadly as possible. My hope is, my raja is, if we do that, inshallah, things, that foreboding darkness that I made reference to from Surah Al-Falaq will yield to a dawn. But we can't be overly naive and idealistic. We have to realize that will only happen if we strive, if we all become really mujahidun to that end.
My crystal ball is not going to be unlike most lawyers. So there'll be a good answer and there'll be a bad answer. The good answer, and I do believe this, is that I'm optimistic that at some point we will return to the open society that is so characteristically American, that is so respectful of differences and encourages those differences and diversity to have the full melting pot that makes us so unique in the world today. I think at some point we will return to that. The pre 9/11 world that we were so accustomed to. On the other hand, I do think, though, that all of us, that we have to work to make sure that happens. And I don't think that it's necessarily going to it's certainly not going to happen without all of us working toward that end. But even with all of the work that organizations are already doing, and will continue to do, it's going to take some time. Again, it took 50 years before America could say, I'm sorry to the Japanese for interning them during World War II and to pay them reparations for what happened to them. And America is loath to apologize historically and as a general rule for doing wrong. It is yet to do so to African Americans for, in any sort of formal way, at least official way, for the enslavement of my ancestors. But in time, I'm even optimistic that that's going to happen. So, on the one hand, we will be the society that we have come to love and respect and expect again. When that's going to happen, I'm not so sure, but it will happen one day.
And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, trust in Allah and tie up your camel. I'm a firm believer, as you can tell, in God and in Allah, in prayer and in hope and in destiny and in opportunity. It is up to us, trusting in God and trusting in Allah, to make the most of the opportunities in this country to change the situation we are unhappy with. If we allow Mr. Ashcroft to continue unchallenged, this will be a religious war, but it will not be a war against Islam. It will be a war against good people versus evil people. And I think that is what we have to understand, is that there are hundreds of thousands and hundreds of millions of people outside the United States and inside this country who do not agree with the conflict that is going on in this country for the soul of the United States. And that soul of the United States is based on tolerance. It's based on acceptance. It's based on understanding. And so my crystal ball is very much part of my belief that if I work hard and I trust in Allah, that I will reap justice. And if that isn't worth working for, then what is worth working for? Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a very informative session here. But what I want to do is, as you leave here, remind you that all the changes that we were talking about, all the optimism that we do have in store, it is not going to become reality by attending conventions. And I point the finger at myself first. It's not going to happen by our speaking out here, by speeches. The changes are going to come by each one of us making the commitment when we go back to become actively supportive of the concerns that you have learned. So that is what we all have to leave here, recognize the information that you've received, become involved, and be a part of the change that is so essential for this country, and this is our country. So let's change it for the better together. Thank you. A big round of applause for our panelists, please. And thank you for your forbearance. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Yes, we're now